This podcast is brought to you by Craft Spirits and Distilling for those who make and drink great spirits. Join our free email newsletter for technical and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Learn more at spiritsanddistilling.com.
Hello, welcome to the Craft Spirits and Distilling podcast, episode 6. I'm your host, Molly Troop. Today with me, I have Andy Garrison. He is the head distiller at Stone Barn Brandyworks and the owner and proprietor of Tough Talk Distilling. Andy has had the privilege of making a lot of different spirits in his 12 years as a distiller. A lot of those would be categorized as obscure. And obscure really means that the general population might not have experience with them. But a lot of these spirits are rooted in tradition and date back hundreds of years ago, at least in some distillation manual translated from a different language. So it's interesting to see how consumers respond to them and really the technicality behind making them. And that's really what we're going to dive in today with Andy talking about making rum and whiskey, where we're talking about making potato eau de vie. And we're also talking about things like carrot eau de vie and how interesting and different that spirit can be. Before we jump into the conversation, are you looking to expand into aluminum cans but worried about corrosivity, off flavors, scalping, or pinhole leaks? Atalk is a premium performance can proven to double product shelf life. Its manufacturing process requires no water, coolants, chemicals, or wastewater treatment. Atalk is a fully recyclable and BPANI and PFAS-free, crafted for higher ABV products, acidic ingredients, emulsions, salt, and sulfates. Atalk is the toughest, most sustainable can for your brand. American Canning manufactures Atalk in Austin, Texas. Contact American Canning for a free compatibility consult or visit atalk.com. And craft spirits makers know firsthand that the best ingredient is love. Arrive Point of Sale combines industry expertise, essential tasting room tools, and a whole lot of love to make running your distillery easier. Scale faster with Arrive's mobile system that offers flexible service with QR code ordering, detailed reporting, and award-winning customer support. New customers get your first month free when you launch by June 30th, 2024. Visit arrive.com/spirits and distilling and mention this ad. That's ARRYVED.com/spirits and distilling. Andy, thank you so much for being with me today.
Yeah, happy to be here. It's beautiful Monday morning in Portland, Oregon.
Beautiful Monday. I mean, we're just thankful that it's not currently raining, but that could change in about 30 minutes.
Rain is fine. Rain is good.
Rain is good.
You know,
agricultural
keeps the flowers
abundance.
Moist.
Yeah. It makes your roses really pretty.
My roses are spectacular right now. It's really something. It's like the only thing in my life I feel pride and vanity about is how wonderful my rose garden is.
And what a beautiful thing to take pride in. I mean, it's just such a wonderful thing to look at and experience on a daily. I really want to talk about your background and how you ended up being a distiller.
Yeah. So yes, hello everyone. My name is Andy Garrison. I am the head distiller at Stone Barn Brandyworks, boutique for brandy and whiskey distillery in Portland, Oregon. I also have my own distillery license and label called Tough Talk, which we can talk about a little bit later. But yeah, I got into distilling in 2012 professionally, and into distilling before that unprofessionally. I don't have a background in it. You know, I didn't go to school for it. I never taken a science class or chemistry or anything like that. My educational background was in accounting and finance, and I ended up in Portland to work at a big tech company doing accounting and finance. But Portland has a lot of other stuff beyond that. Portland had, at the time, like the most breweries per capita of anywhere in the world, hundreds of wineries, and even in like 2008, 2009, you still have like, I don't know, 8 or 9 distilleries in Portland proper, which is quite unique at the time. Because back then there was maybe only about 300 distilleries in the country in total. So I kind of fell in love with beverages and the culture around it and the people making it. and fell not so deeply in love with accounting and working in an office. So after a few years of doing that, I just quit my job. I had nothing lined up, and I had no experience, and I had no connections. So how I got to where I am now involves like just a lot of luck and I guess hanging out at the right bars. I quit my job wanting to get into distilling, and I took a tour around Portland. We had something called the Distillery Row, which kind of was a trade organization for some of the small distilleries in town to kind of get people moving around and visiting different places. And I went to every distillery on the passport and tried to chat up everyone I encountered. And I managed to convince the owner of Stone Barn Brandyworks to let me come in and, learn or work or whatever. And so I showed up and I pitted cherries for like 6 hours to make cherry brandy. And I kind of just kept showing up after that. Stone Barn at the time was a really small kind of almost hobby business or sort of mom and pop small distillery with the goal of making like German and European style fruit spirits or fruit brandies. So it was really interesting making a lot of different stuff, but it wasn't like a full-time gig. There just wasn't that much work to be done. But after about 6 months or a year or something like that, I got another distilling job. So I became an assistant distiller at House Spirits, which was the biggest distillery in Portland at the time and probably still is. And so I worked at both simultaneously. I would, work a shift at one and then bike across town and work a shift at the other, kind of seeing both sides of the craft distilling coin, from like a large production-oriented distillery cranking out gin every day to a small boutique distillery that's kind of making 30 different products. And I did that for several years, which was really demanding. But you don't make any money. Like pay is not very good. So the only way to get around that is working like 70 hours a week. So I was working about 20 to 40 hours a week at each distillery for several years. And then House Spirits built a beautiful, large new production facility, but they had to get out of the old facility before the new facility was complete. So I wasn't working for about a month in the summer, and the owner of New Deal Distillery, which is sort of a mid-size, regional-oriented, bar-oriented distillery, needed a head distiller, or whatever I was called at the time. So I started working there. That was another kind of piece of the craft distilling coin. They're a very busy contract distillery doing lots of custom bottling, lots of kind of higher volume throughput items, just very busy, very dynamic. They really needed a full-time person, but I was still committed to working at Stone Barn. So after about a year or two, it gets so muddy when you get old.
The details are a little foggy.
Time ticking by. I left there to consult and work on a startup distillery to kind of develop their recipes and processes and set up their equipment and things in that space. And that was interesting because that was kind of the last missing piece of it for me, because the other distilleries I worked at were well established by the time I was there. And we kind of got them running, but at that point, the demands of just driving all over the place and having 2 different jobs and that sort of thing, I really wanted to get out of that and just be at Stone Barn full time. So I worked pretty hard to develop our contract services and custom distillation kind of program. So we're a very, very small distillery, but we do about 700 to 1,000 distillations a year, spread across probably 100 different things. So we're doing custom distillation for wineries, for other distilleries, cideries, all sorts of stuff, which I love. That's been really, really fun for me. really has helped me develop as a distiller, getting to work with so many experienced people from other spheres, from the world of winemaking, which is just so much more technically sophisticated and educated than the distillers are. Getting to work with other distillers who have different concerns and kind of different experiences. And so that's been the story of the last 4 years. Is I'm the head distiller at Stone Barn. I coordinate all of our custom work. And that is a lot.
And when you're saying that you're doing about 700 to 1,000 distillations a year, is that operating at max capacity for you guys, or nearly?
No, it's max capacity within our lifestyles, I would say, which includes a fair bit of European travel each year. So it's just Eric and Sebastian, who are Stone Barn's owners, and me, who do the distilling. And we're only open about 10 hours a day. So we don't really work 2 shifts. We don't distill exactly every day, but we distill most days.
So
you can do a lot at a little place.
Yes, exactly. You guys do push quite a lot of volume.
Yeah, you just have to be dedicated to doing it, and you have to really like it. For me, my mindset is, having worked at a variety of places and had a bunch of experience, it's like I left my job in finance to be a distiller. I didn't leave it to be a salesperson or a logistics coordinator or, an ambassador to something. I left it to run a still. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's about structuring things so that every day I get to do distilling, and that my time spent distilling is not bifurcated by other activities. So it's a different model than how most, I think, craft distilleries are set up. I think someone in my role, with my experience at a lot of places, would not be just hands-on with still anymore every day. But that's not really what I want.
Right.
And I have seen a lot of inspiration traveling in Europe and, visiting traditional distilleries over there. And they're set up much more along the lines that we are. The owner, operator, proprietor, who loves it, who's not looking to grow a brand, who's looking to make spirits and sell them. So it's just a different mindset. And it's one that suits me well as a person who doesn't get along with others.
Just the black cat of the distillery.
Yeah. It's been a long time since I've had a boss or an employee. So, yeah.
Well, I think one of the best indications, just to show how much you love distilling, is really through your Instagram. I'm going to shamelessly plug you real quick at Horrible Poisons on Instagram. Follow Andy. You will leave inspired. But one of the things I've always admired about you and your page is how much education and research that you're doing, and a lot of it with like historical documents that pertain to distilling. And I think that's always fascinating. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So I still feel pretty early in my career, but I've been distilling professionally for 12 years. So the industry itself has shifted a lot in that time, and the resources available to people that want to learn have also become significantly more robust. But when I was kind of getting going, there weren't a lot of people to ask questions about, and there was not a lot written in our time frame that related to craft distilling. There were some technical books that are out there developed by the Scotch whiskey industry or the fuel ethanol industry, but they had relatively little relevance to making 30 liters of cherry brandy, or whatever it was we were attempting to do at the distillery. So the source for a lot of that knowledge is just older books from back before we had a really industrially developed, kind of tightly concentrated distilling industry before Prohibition, or in other countries in Europe where they had never really lost those traditions, where they didn't have Prohibition. They maintained small scale farm schnapps distilleries or craft distilleries. So that got me looking at all sorts of weird books in all sorts of weird languages. And one book kind of leads to the next. You find some thin, tiny kernel of information in a book, but then you see the bibliography and it has all of these wonderful, perfect, exotic sounding books that are going to answer all of your questions and solve all of your troubles. So you scrounge the internet and eBay and used bookstores, and then that book arrives and it turns out actually doesn't really answer your questions, but it does suggest another book that might have the answer to your question. And so you kind of go on in this iterative quest. And eventually you've piled up a huge stack of books and you've learned a ton of stuff in pursuit of whatever it was you were originally trying to find out. And then, at some point in the future, someone approaches you with, many thousands of pounds of carrots. And you say, oh yeah, I know that they distill carrots in Hungary. They supplement apple brandy mash with carrots or whatever. And you're like, okay, well, that wasn't useful to me when I was trying to figure out germination temperature for corn or whatever it was, but it's stuck in there. And it just becomes, you kind of become your own Google. You can answer your own questions. You can do your own research. And it's very powerful. But it requires a fair bit of commitment, and it really requires a lot of interest because no one's ever going to make you do it. So if you don't like doing, if you don't like holding your phone up to a book and Google translating Czech into English and trying to parse the results, you're not going to do it. It's hard to have the full experience or enrichment of kind of global distilling culture without that and without travel.
Absolutely. And I mean, just seeing all the different viewpoints, and as you were talking, going through Europe and seeing the hows and the whys behind what they're doing, what they're making, it's fascinating. And I mean, they can be very disconnected to more of the capitalistic side of trying to grow something big and leaning into that, but also brings a lot of value.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see because I think in America, I mean, distilling is just like any other business, and people aren't really quality oriented. They're success oriented, and they define success by how much money you make or how much product you sell or things like that. And that is just kind of a limiting mindset for pursuing certain categories of spirits. Whereas there's a more rational kind of reason to make some of these things that are rooted in agriculture. Like fruit trees produce a surplus of fruit. They produce more fruit than you can possibly use. It made perfect sense to make fruit brandy, and for every farm to do it back when every farm had fruit trees. But if you strip away every farm having fruit trees and you kind of work backwards and you're like, okay, I want to make fruit brandy. How do I find the fruit? How do I afford the fruit? All of a sudden, you've got this hugely expensive product. It doesn't make any sense anymore. So you kind of have gone in this inverse chain from something that made sense to something that doesn't really make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Whiskey is kind of the other end of the spectrum, where whiskey used to be periodically they would fan making it, because it takes literally food out of people's mouths. It takes grain that could have sustained someone and turns it into whiskey and hog feed. And now we've scaled industry and agriculture such that like corn has so little value. It's so artificially supported and deflated that you're like, well, it doesn't make any sense to make anything other than grain spirit because it's so cheap and so high yielding and so easy. But it's totally irrational it used to be irrational and now it became rational. But I think both of those developments are bad and wrong fundamentally. I think it should have gone the other way. And so I like visiting, European distilleries or traditional fruit brandy distilleries, because you can still kind of get a feel of it, of the like peasant rationality to what you're doing, rather than it feeling really like indulgent or stupid or contrived. It still makes sense some places. And so part of what I am trying to do with Tough Talk, which is kind of my label and business, is without really talking about it or letting people know, reinsert some rationality to making these exotic and unusual spirits, or it's not really that interesting to me to, buy pineapples from Maui and ship them here. But because of how our supply chain works, they end up here sometimes with no use or home or customer. And so rather than relying on nature to produce these surpluses, like how fruit trees work, there's an element of relying on the supply chain to produce these sort of surpluses and then trying to rationalize those into something that's value added and interesting and useful.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the themes for our talk today is kind of obscure, but when you're down to it, it's maybe obscured now, not traditionally so. But let's kind of dive into some of the obscure things that you've helped produce at Stone Barn and as well as at Tough Talk. But the first one I wanted to dive into is, you already mentioned it. I think we have to go there first, is carrot eau de vie.
Yes, carrots.
Carrots. The surprising star of, did you say apple brandy?
Well, they are using apples to kind of fill out the carrots. But someone told me that originally carrots came about to be used because there was like a failure of the apple crop. I don't know if that's exactly true, but it's been interesting.
It's a great story.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. I became interested in it. There is reference to it in some older books that I've seen, kind of going way back when they were really trying to develop the sugar beet industry in France. And they were looking at basically everything that you could produce ethanol from. And so there's some passing mention of carrots in there. But really what triggered my interest was talking to a carrot breeder at an event. And he explained to me the different metrics for carrot flavor. The different levers they pull in the breeding programs are sugar, which makes sense, and like shape and color, which makes sense, and terpene content. And I was like, terpene content? That's like in gin? And it turns out it's many of the same terpenes that are present in like certain hops and juniper. But then I was like, wow, okay, I wonder if distilled carrots will taste like gin. So it kind of sat in the back burner idea file. I was interested in it. I reached out to some people. I thought about having my farmer friend grow it. But the yields from doing it are kind of mind-bogglingly small. Carrots are not as sweet as we perceive them to be. There's something like 4 to 6% sugar, which means the ferment is 2 to 3% alcohol, which means...
yeah, that's
a liter of carrot eau de vie is something like 100 pounds of carrots. So I didn't want to necessarily grow a lot of carrots just to distill them, but some surplus organic carrots came to me. The bunch weight of them was slightly off. So instead of each bunch weighing like 3/4 of a pound, it weighed like 3/6 of a pound. It was like each bunch was like a couple ounces lighter than it was supposed to be. So the grocery stores rejected them. So I got all of these beautiful, pristine, organic carrots. And once they arrived, you go, okay, well, I wonder how all this works. So yeah, I had to topping the carrots was not that bad for 4,000 pounds. It was like, whatever that is, 10,000 bunches or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
What was really the arduous part was removing all the rubber bands. Ended up with like 15 pounds of rubber bands from all these bunches of carrots.
That's amazing.
But yeah, so the carrots are washed, they're milled, put them into the fermenter. And at that point, there's like a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen. I've done a number of things like this where it's like, I know that they're theoretically possible, but sometimes the literature doesn't have exactly what needs to be done, or they assume that you already know, that it's so obvious, that you've been doing this your whole life. So the carrots were in the bin, and you're like, oh, it looks like just a big bin of orange sand. Like, where's the juice going to come from? How is this going to become a liquid?
Mm-hmm.
But the next day I showed up to do punch downs, and they had just like leached out all of this juice. And over the course of like 3 days, they totally dissolve into just like a puree. And they ferment it out. The ferment is really unusual to taste. Carrot juice without sugar in it is one of the worst tasting things I feel like I've ever tried.
Is it on par with sunchokes?
It's worse than that because it's really salty, but it's like a mineral salt. It's like really alkaline. It's very unusual. So yeah, I did the distilling, and distilling something that's that low in alcohol is always like a little bit heartbreaking.
Absolutely.
You fill the still and then nothing comes out.
You're like, did I do something wrong? Is there a leak?
Yeah.
You go through all your kind of safety checks again and again.
Fundamental than that. You're just like, why did I do this? Why did I elect this life?
Right.
What was I thinking?
Why am I not an accountant still?
Why don't I just make bourbon every day? Yeah. But then you taste it and wow, it's really something. It's like totally distinctly carrots, but also unlike any carrot that you've ever had, just because the concentration of putting 100 pounds of carrots into 2 pounds of spirit, you're concentrating all the aroma, all the kind of terpene, and it's very unusual, very powerful tasting, which is kind of surprising from something like a carrot, which everyone is familiar with and kind of immune to its charms to some extent. So that was, then I was like, okay, from there, I've done a bunch of other ones. And it is fascinating just to see people's engagement with them, which I see kind of through Instagram or through people coming by the distillery. Because we've done some equally arduous, totally beautiful, traditional fruit brandies. Like I've done medlar. Medlar is quite an obscure fruit, very old. It's referenced in like Shakespeare and Chaucer and medieval cookery manuals. And cassis, we did a blackcurrant eau de vie. It's very, very expensive. We do quince eau de vie every year. They're all really flavorful, and medlar's not, but they're all quite interestingly flavored. But people don't know what they are. They're like, Americans just don't know what those fruits are. So the kind of intensity of making them is a bit lost on people.
Yeah.
But like something like carrot. I also did a potato eau de vie, which we can talk a little bit more about. I most recently did banana eau de vie. They're stuff that Americans are much more familiar with, and so they're more excited about them.
Right.
To me, they're less exciting because they don't have necessarily as much nobility. They're like a supply chain thing for me.
Mm-hmm. They're trash.
But they're trash. Yeah. Yes.
And
trash.
we say that with love, but
yeah, but they're trash that Americans know, and so like, oh my God, do you want to taste this rowan berry eau de vie? I think I'm the only person in America that's ever made one. And they're like, no, not really. And you're like, you want to taste banana eau de vie? And they're like, yeah. Does it taste like bananas? And you're like, it does. And they're like, cool. So you just gotta roll where people are at and try to sneak the other stuff in there, I guess.
Right. Taste this banana rowan berry beverage. We combined them.
Yeah, it's a possibility. Everything's on the table.
Exactly. And now I think we need to dive into Maker's Choice. Do you want to talk about banana or potato first?
Well, the potato is interesting. It's kind of more interesting to me because it has a much longer history.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, for my little business, Tough Talk, the first release I did was Kartoffelschnaps, basically potato brandy.
And that's just fun to say.
And yeah, Kartoffelschnaps. My wife was like, do not label it that. People will not try it. Like, all right. Good advice.
Good advice, Margaret.
But it is a spirit that's been around a long time, basically since people in Europe kind of clued into the fact that potatoes can be distilled. The earliest references I found were from about 1650 in parts of Germany, where they were recorded distilling potatoes. And there was some mandates for peasant farmers back then to plant potatoes. So they kind of had them at the ready, but they weren't necessarily that into potatoes yet because they were new and they were foreign and they were being forced to grow them. And so I think that's a little bit of why distilling them became so prevalent. But it became massively prevalent enough that there were famines. It precipitated like an alcohol crisis, kind of similar to like the gin craze or that era of British alcohol production, which ultimately led to like excise taxes and liquor licensing and distillery regulation, and kind of helped precipitate the development of the industrial alcohol industry in Germany. But the distillation of the potato, people hear potato and they think vodka. So like a neutral, clear, light spirit with maybe like a little bit of creamy potato mouthfeel or something. But the distillation of potato predates the ability to make a really highly rectified neutral spirit by several hundred years. Maybe the earliest ones were the Pastorius still in like whatever that was, 1820. But it means they were mashing, fermenting, and distilling potatoes just the way you would do whiskey. So on a pot still to relatively low strength, the potatoes are cooked and then sacrificed with malt. It was just interesting. It was like, well, what happens if you leave all the flavor of the potato in? And that was kind of the basis for doing it and trying it. I'd read history books about it. I'd seen reference to it. I had tried another one that someone in Canada had made. It was really fascinating. So I gave it a whirl, and it's one of those things that kind of causes you to look at the raw material in a new light, because a lot of our association with potato flavor is with what we've done to the potato.
Right.
Is it baked?
It's a great vessel.
Is it fried? Is it covered in cheese? We're doing all sorts of stuff to the potato. But the raw underlying flavor of the potato it's more profound than we acknowledge. And it's a little bit displeasing in certain ways. And the eau de vie, the brandy, has this crazy, it's like you've just grated, 100 pounds of potatoes, raw, freshly grated potatoes, and you're driving around with it in your car with the windows up. It's like cucumber, horseradish, dill, but also like chocolate, black pepper. It's really earthy. It's quite creamy. It's very sweet. It was just really interesting. And it was a perfect spirit for me because it's like both compelling flavor-wise and it has a cool history. It's like part of a larger chain of distilling history. And so that was satisfying. And people liked it, I think. I mean, it sold out, and now I'm not thinking about it anymore. So,
and it's a great time to just make a little segue right here. Omnibibalist means able or willing to drink almost anything. That's the attitude of the consumer you're trying to reach. They're omnibibalists. How does your distillery remain competitive? Distillers must future-proof their business with a multi-segment production attitude to meet consumers with the right beverages for the right occasions. Encompass Production Cloud is a software designed to help you lead in the modern beverage industry. Now, omnibibalist consumer is a good thing. Become future-proofed at encompasstech.com. Also, at RMS Roller Grinder, they design and build quality roller mills and grain handling systems for your specific distilling needs. From idea to installation, they can help with roller mills, augers, control panels, bulk storage, and more. RMS has the right equipment to help you increase efficiency, simplify your process, and create a quality crafted product. Contact them today at rmsrollergrinder.com to work with their experts on your new distillery build or expansion. So I think it's really interesting when you talk about, because especially with potato, where people aren't going to be super familiar like with this product. And I think where people have seen distilled potatoes before is in vodka. And you see a lot of the flavor that's remaining in a potato vodka is very kind of the field. And it's people kind of either they love it or they don't. I feel like when you're talking about an eau de vie, you have a lot more of that, but it's also a lot more complexity. Is there a way you can describe it that kind of like bridges that gap of information?
Yeah. So Americans are quite fearful of clear spirits. I don't know exactly why, but if we have a big lineup of stuff in the tasting room at Stone Barn, and there's a percentage of people that won't try any of the clear ones. It doesn't really matter whether the flavor is really intense or not intense, or whether it's soft or whether it's fiery. They perceive all of them the same way, as fiery, or as gasoline or turpentine or whatever. But they're not actually tasting and they're not actually smelling. They're just like locked into this idea that someone else has planted in their mind, or maybe some past experience has suggested. Mm-hmm. And those people are quite hard to reach with a lot of what we're doing, because they don't tend to believe you. They kind of, without actually having any expertise, view themselves as an expert on the topic. And so it's the difference between vodka and eau de vie for them is like almost not worth teasing out, because they're so closed to the idea of like a really high-end, beautiful, aromatic, complex, clear spirit. They like don't view it as possible. But there's another set of people that they kind of ignore clear spirits because they think they're going to be neutral. They think they're going to be like vodka. And when you expose them to like a quince eau de vie or a pear eau de vie or something that's got tons of character, tons of aroma, they're into it. And they kind of want to know why. How can it taste like this if it's clear? And then you have to kind of talk about how distilling works and how barrel aging works and how smells work. And it can be a big educational lift that I'm not always prepared to do or able to achieve. With the potato, it was already being marketed just because of how my business were, and to people that are pretty into spirits. Like my audience, as I perceive it, is spirit geeks, is people who are interested in something unusual and esoteric. Mm-hmm. So if they were starting from the position of potato vodka, it tastes like X. In everything I wrote about it in the press release, on the website, I made pains to say it's not vodka. I described it as like the ancient ancestor to vodka before we had the technology to make distilled potatoes boring. Sure. And people like that, it feels authentic. It might not be authentic, but it feels authentic, which is very valuable to someone who's interested in these kind of unusual things. And it has a little bit of an adversarial position, which people generally like. If they are into spirits, they're typically also into hating on vodka for whatever reason. Even though vodka can be great. So you're able to differentiate by sort of denigrating something else, which is maybe a challenging position to be in. It's not going to work for everything. There's no banana-based vodka out there to kind of compare to.
Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah, it's probably out there somewhere in Uganda. That's my rambling answer to. I'm actually making the heads cut on the still right now, so I sort of just set my mouth to run.
Well, you have to do a lot of thought when you're making heads cut.
Yeah, I'm in the distillery. It's important to always be distilling if you're gonna stay in business. So
the ABDs of running the distillery.
Yes. What are some other fun products we did? We got a fair bit of press. We made a whiskey out of ramen noodles, which was pretty fun. It was one of the more fun projects that we've done. And it was fun because of collaboration and partnership, which is kind of a good lesson for me. A friend of mine who's in Portland owns We Organic, which is a noodle company. They make organic ramen noodles out of local organic grain. But they're fresh noodles. They're like not the dried instant ramen. They're closer to like a fresh pasta. They're in the refrigerated section because they have a shelf life. And I was really into the noodles. We were eating them all the time. And I was just I think maybe I left some in the fridge and forgot about them and then found them later. And I was like, what happens to the noodles when that happens? And I reached out to Lola. And it turned out in the course of developing the recipe and the noodles, they had like about 1,000 pounds of noodles in cold storage that were just like they ended up using a different package, or some had more salt, or, they stocked too many at a store and then had to take them out as they were kind of just starting the company. So she was overjoyed for me to take them and remove them from her life. And I had known Lola through some of the local grain organizations. There was something called Cascadia Grains, which was about connecting grain milling infrastructure and bakers and farmers, that whole thing in Cascadia in the Pacific Northwest. So it turned out she was getting grain for the noodles from some of the same places we were getting grain to make our whiskey. So it seemed like, hey, let's make whiskey out of this.
Why not?
And the process was, why not? I felt pretty confident that the TTB was going to let us call it whiskey. So we went along that path, because the only ingredients in the noodles are wheat, barley, salt, sodium chloride, and then kansui, which is essentially lye powder, which is a little bit weird, but also people use it to adjust mash water sometimes, or to add mineral to mash water. So I felt like we were going to be able to call it whiskey. We got all the noodles, dumped them out into a huge bowl. It was quite unusual to see like 400 pounds of noodles all swirling about like a big bowl of worms. We have a maybe OSHA approved drill with a big blade on the end of it that we use to pass through. It's approved in Germany, so, and they're smarter than we are. So it must be safe. But yeah, so we used that and we blended them all up, and the mash was interesting because of the kansui. I was like mixing the noodles up with my hands a little bit to detangle them. Like, man, my hands are really kind of raw feeling. You feel it red and itchy. And then I realized the kansui is like lye. And the pH of the whiskey mash was like 8 instead of 5 or 5.5. So it was super, super alkaline. And we had to adjust the pH way down with acid to kind of get something that would work for starch conversion and for fermentation. But the whiskey itself retained some of that mineral character, this kind of unique, salty, ultra hard water kind of aspect. And it was really cool. We kind of pitched the whiskey after 4 years as a highball whiskey, and like a Japanese style highball whiskey. And the minerality that came through in the whiskey really worked well with like an ultra high carbonation soda water, which made a really like satisfying, full bodied kind of quenching highball. And we ended up doing it sort of as a joint partnership with the city of Kobe, who's a sister city with Portland. They sponsored some promotional materials. So we like printed a zine and we had a custom made label done. And we sponsored a week of events at local bars where whiskey highballs were served with yakisoba pan, which is like yakisoba noodles in a hot dog bun with all sorts of toppings, which is like a like a Japanese high school student post baseball practice kind of like carb on carb.
Delicious
hour snack.
Yeah,
it was great. It was tons of fun. Unfortunately we released it like in the peak of both dry January and the second COVID wave. So it was a challenging time for bars. But we got a lot of great feedback. People were like, this is the only fun thing that's happened to us in months. And, thank you for doing something for us to kind of look forward to and to get people out. So,
and it did sell out relatively quick, right?
It did. Yeah. We priced it pretty affordably, for bars to use it in highballs. And, it sold out pretty quick. People maybe think it's going to taste like soup. tastes like one of the packets instead of the noodles. But I think that was part of like trying to get a lot of it served in bars rather than just do bottle sales out of the distillery, was like get people to drink it and try it and not think it's going to be something that's not necessarily. It was a really fun project. It was one of the first projects that captured a bunch of non-beverage people for us, like working with Lola, who is not a beverage person. She's a food person. A really different perspective. Similarly, working with her graphic designer, and she got to learn all about the horrors of trying to get a label approved by the government.
Something I'm hoping she quickly forgot.
Yeah.
With a product like this as well, I mean, it's fun, and I think that's probably one of the reasons people responded the way it did. It's just fun and an original whiskey style that, I mean, I don't think anyone else I've ever heard of is making a rum and whiskey. So do you think that's one of the reasons that people just, especially in COVID, they just needed something fun to look forward to?
Yeah, I guess so. It's like it's kind of like what I was saying with bananas or potatoes, or it has the veil of familiarity, but is actually a novelty. And that's kind of like the perfect mixture to gain people's attention. Because it's, at the end of the day, it's just a starch that we blended up and distilled. It's not fantastically exotic. I know there's other people that have done things similar, out of bread or donuts or whatever, Twinkies from the Twinkie factory.
Do those actually ferment?
I think I read you have to de-oil them. You have to let the oil float to the surface and then remove that.
That sounds like a very glamorous process.
Yeah. Is any part of the process glamorous?
You're right. And people seem to think that it is. It really is not.
No, it's a lot of mopping.
No.
But yeah, the ramen noodle was good because it was like, had a hook. It sounds unusual, but it doesn't actually taste that unusual. It tastes just like kind of a regular drinkable light Japanese highball whiskey. And that's not always like the space I would like to be in or inhabit. But as far as marketing, sales, branding, that's probably the most, the best space to be tackling.
Sure.
You see it with the success of like Empirical's Dorito flavored spirit. It's like Empirical's been making unusual stuff for many years. The most press they've ever gotten was when they just flavored something like chips you can buy at the gas station. So yeah, I don't know what that says about us as, drinkers or consumers. It's probably not good, whatever it is, but it is an interesting insight, especially if you're trying to make stuff that comes from within you, that you need to figure out how to sell. That's kind of what I'm grappling with right now with my business. Tough Talk is I've made a lot of, to me, very interesting, really unusual, really flavor-oriented spirits. And now I need to figure out how to get other people as excited about them as I am. And some of them are proving to be easier than others. Mm-hmm. And it's about this kind of veil or intermixture of like familiarity and novelty.
Yeah, let's talk about that. What is the potential next release for Tough Talk?
What is it going to be? It is, so a friend of mine, I in harvest time get all sorts of phone calls or emails or questions when people have, too much or something. Often they don't have as much as they think, or they have way more than I could ever possibly use. But every now and then there's about the right size project. Someone had some grapes out in Canby, or Malala, which is like kind of Nowheresville, Oregon. And I needed some help picking grapes. So a couple of friends of mine came and helped me pick them. We got just a small amount of Pinot Gris. And I was interested to do a technique like a whole grape distillate, Distillate de Uva or Mosta Verde, or the skins and the seeds and the juice aren't separated. It's all fermented together and it's all distilled together. And that's often done with aromatic white varieties because it kind of boosts the terpene content, boosts the aromatic profile. But Pinot Gris is actually a red grape. People think of it as a white wine, but it is a red grape. So when you ferment it all together and distill it all together, it actually tastes pretty much like grappa, like a classic red grappa. And I tried it and I was like, this is okay. This is like not, whatever. I tasted it and I poured it out into my cup of coffee that I was having and I drank that and I was like, oh, this is really good. This is like what it should be. So I connected with a coffee person who's friends with the person who helped me pick the grapes. And we're like, we're going to make an espresso and grappa mixture, a mixture of grappa and espresso. And I got it all formulated. I got a label approved. I made a test batch. And I set up a meeting of distillers in Portland for another reason. And people were asking me just the question you did, what's next? And I was like, oh, it's like this mixture of grappa and espresso. And someone was like, oh, like an espresso martini. And I was like,
but kind of.
I guess so. And this other friend of mine was like, oh, I thought you'd wait longer before just selling out. And I was like, oh.
But when things are delicious, you kind of, have to do it.
I scrapped the whole thing. I was like, well, you're right. All right, I got to do more. So I was like kind of not angrily, I was just like, when someone's right and you don't want them to be right, but they are right. I was like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And so I was having some grappa and some espresso. And I was like, oh yeah, the other thing that goes with this is biscotti. That's like the trifecta, you have espresso, you have a biscotti, and you have grappa. So the release is actually going to be an espresso and biscotti flavored grappa. It is like not rooted in anything. There's no interesting tradition behind it as far as I could ascertain. I wasn't inspired by anything I read. I was just eating lunch, and that's the inspiration. So it'll be like a pretty small release, just for fun, and then hopefully back to more serious stuff after that.
Well, if I could add to your PR, it sounds like you were just eating lunch and that's what you were craving, right? So it's maybe what everyone's craving.
Let's hope. Yeah. Yeah, and I can't have, there's not that many limits on when I can have grappa, but there are hard limits on when I can have espresso. So the after lunch period is about the ideal time for combining the two for me. So that it's going to be called dopo pranzo, which means like after lunch in Italian.
Perfect. You're bringing back the lunch martini, but just in a very different style.
In a more concentrated on the go format. Yeah.
Perfect. I don't know who that doesn't appeal to. Drink responsibly. Well, that looks like a great place to bring this episode to a close. Andy, I just want to thank you so much for your time. It's been fun talking about all the obscure and yet traditional spirits that you've had the ability to make. I know I can speak for myself when you're living a lot of a maker's dream of just being able to be creative and create things that are very interesting from a personal place, or maybe not, but having fun doing it, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's, if you're not going to make a lot of money, you should at least have fun. So
wise words to live by.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to seeing what's next from you guys. And if anyone out there has any questions about bananas or rowan berries, feel free to shoot me an email.
Yeah, where can they best find you?
Andy.w.garrison@gmail.com or on Instagram at Oracle Poisons.
Such a great name. Well, Andy, thank you again.
Yeah, no problem.
American Cannade's A-Talk is a premium performance can proven to double product shelf life. Arrive Point of Sale combines industry expertise and essential taste room tools to make running your distillery easier. Future-proof your distillery and remain competitive with Encompass Production Cloud software. RMS Roller Grinder has the equipment to help you increase efficiency, simplify your process, and create a quality product. If you've enjoyed this podcast, go to spiritsanddistilling.com and sign up for our free newsletter featuring new stories every week from some of the best writers and distillers in the distilling world. You can find out more about Andy at stonebarnbrandyworks.com, or you can also follow him on Instagram at Horrible Poisons. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another in-depth distilling conversation for you. Thanks for joining us.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Spirits and Distilling for those who love to make and drink great spirits. Join our free newsletter today at spiritsanddistilling.com for pragmatic, technical, and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Sign up now at spiritsanddistilling.com or click on the link in the show notes.